So hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. If some of you had attended yesterday's session, welcome back. This will be a very similar session with regards to the information provided, but feel free to ask any questions that you might have. For those that are just joining us, I'd mentioned previously, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can put them in the Q&A box and I will get to them towards the end of the webinar. The webinar itself is only 30 minutes, so I'm going to try to optimize as much time to go through some of the material before going to Q&A. Now, the webinar today is about the book, The Art of Pharmacoeconomics, which is available now on Amazon if you are interested in it. But we're going to go into a lot more detail about what is the need, that type of thing. So during our time together for this 30 minutes, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time at the beginning just introducing myself. So I am the author of The Art of Pharmacoeconomics. So just to give you a little background for those that might not know me before or not attended any of our events through Salus Vitae Group. And then I will talk a little bit about resource scarcity and decision making, which are two big topics that are really kind of the foundation to when we start talking about pharmacoeconomics or economic analyses in general. And then we'll go into what is pharmacoeconomics. I do recognize that there are different there are attendees at different stages with regards to what they know about pharmacoeconomics. Some might do this on a day-to-day basis. Some might be very new to the topic. So I'll give a very brief intro as what it is, how is it used, that type of thing. And then we'll go into a lot more detail about the book. So what does it entail? What are the different sections and chapters, and how you might benefit from it, and who should really read it? So who's it really designed for, and then how to use it. And so I talk a little bit here about both in the classroom in terms of kind of the quote unquote traditional learning environment, if you would like more information on this topic, versus actually professional settings. So many of you might not be in the classroom per se, but are interested in this topic or utilize this topic on a day-to-day basis, or how you might benefit from that. So we're just going to touch on all of these elements to different degrees through our time together. Okay, so a little bit about me. So my name is Rola Kaakeh. I am the author of The Art of Pharmacoeconomics, and I'm currently the CEO of Salus Vitae Group, and I'm also adjunct faculty at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine and affiliate faculty at their Institute for Global Health. So I do teach as in parallel to my other roles. I am a fellowship trained licensed pharmacist, so I did complete a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in pharmacoeconomics, pharmaceutical outcomes, health services research from the University of Michigan in 3 different schools. So the School of Public Health, College of Pharmacy, and School of Medicine, because as you can see, the topic actually spans across different kind of disciplines or areas within healthcare. I have worked in various different settings, both in academic settings as well as corporate, and across various pharmacy practice settings. I am on what you would consider kind of the spectrum of the learner of pharmacoeconomics. So I learned this when I went through pharmacy school, but then having completed a postdoctoral fellowship, I went into a lot more detail and training within this field. But I've also taught the subject on a graduate school level. So I have taught pharmacoeconomics in colleges of pharmacy and have been in this space for quite some time. Now, in my current role as CEO of a consultancy, we advise a wide range of institutions, so universities, corporations, consultancies, and various different associations, and NGOs or organizations that focus on public health. So my areas of focus have been quite broad with regards to national policies, but then have been very specific with regards to institution-specific initiatives, and even kind of thinking through about how we make decisions within healthcare across various different topics to improve things such as access, delivery, and outcomes. So that's just a little bit about me, but a lot of the background and my interest in pharmacoeconomics started a long time ago, and I built these kind of different skill sets with regards to how can we learn it, and then how do we actually communicate it across different settings, and how do we use it in quote unquote the real world to influence or improve our decision-making process. Now, like I mentioned, it would not be fair to talk about pharmacoeconomics or really economic analysis in general without first talking about our current realities of resource scarcity and decision-making process. Now, if we talk about resource scarcity in general, there are several realities that we currently have or things that we have to think about, mostly really on a day-to-day basis. We have very limited finite resources. And I do recognize, and I think many of us recognize, that our limited and finite resources can really vary based where we are in the world, where we are geographically, even within certain cities, that type of thing. But the reality of limited finite resource exists across the globe. But then you have to also couple that with budget restrictions. So we don't necessarily have open-ended budgets, and we have this current limited finite resource reality. And then you have to actually also couple that with high costs. So there's a lot of innovation and a lot of progress, and we know with a lot of innovation and a lot of progress, there's also high costs associated with that. So these are things we're constantly thinking about. But on top of that is that because we're also progressing and there's a lot of innovation, our choices continue to increase. And so we have to make different decisions based off of the various choices that we have, given finite resources and budget constraints. So that means we have to start thinking about allocation decisions. So that means we have to be very intentional and proactive in thinking about what, how, and to whom we spend our time and resources. So we have to start asking hard questions like, how much are you willing to pay to solve an issue? And it could be very specific at a specific issue, or it can then become much more broad, which makes it a lot more difficult to answer these questions. So questions like, how much are you willing to pay to extend a life or to save a life or extend life for a year? When you have to make very specific allocation decisions. Also, questions that are quite difficult for many is, what should policymakers and society be willing to pay for an additional or incremental unit of health gain? Because the reality is there's never a blank check in healthcare, and really much never a blank check in many things because of these realities. So how do we objectively decide where to allocate our resources is a common question we face every single day across disciplines, and specifically in healthcare, where so much of the focus is on improving health outcomes. But when we know that when we're equipped with better information, we can more efficiently assign these resources, which then gets us to the topic of decision-making in general and looking at our own decisions. Now, an overarching goal should be to provide more objective evidence-based decision-making in healthcare. And to do that effectively, we need to understand our environments and how we make decisions. So I talk a lot about the book, the whole aspect of decision-making and decision-making process, because the decision-making process is very multidimensional. If you even look on an individual basis, you start thinking about how are you making your own decisions? Do you understand how you're making your own decisions? Do you constantly evaluate it? Do you systematically look at it and evaluate how you choose one option over the other? Right? This is quite difficult. We think that we might understand, but we often wonder when we start thinking about our own decision-making processes, how much of that is what we consider evidence-based, right? What is driving our decisions? Decisions, like I mentioned, is such a decision-making process in general, is such a big topic. And in the book is what you see on the right in terms of the different types of topics that we talk about with regards to decisions. So things such as decision criteria, decision models, when you get more deep into the methodology, decision questions, decision rules, decision trees, decision makers, which are extremely diverse, specifically in healthcare. And so I talk through a lot about what are the different types of decision makers, kind of what are their roles and what you have to keep in mind. And then also in the book, there's a decision-making questionnaire, which like I said here, where you have to evaluate your own decision-making process, maybe you as an individual, and that same questionnaire can be used at an institutional level as well, or an organizational level. But that really gets down to the decision-making process, because like I'd mentioned, it was really important to think through about your own decision-making process because of the need to effectively allocate resources. So now when it comes to pharmacoeconomics, what is pharmacoeconomics? So pharmacoeconomics is a type of outcomes research, which is a broad, complex methodological discipline that really looks at the end result of things. So it looks at the benefits, the risks, the results, and the real world impact of specific interventions. So that being outcomes research, pharmacoeconomics is a type, and it is also a subset of health economics that really focuses on pharmaceutical interventions. So if you look at health economics in general, there's different analyses that is used. And then when you start looking at it pertaining to pharmaceutical products and services, that's where it becomes pharmacoeconomics. And so we know that medications and things related to pharmaceutical products and services are a large percentage of our budget. So this topic has become extremely important because pharmacoeconomics is used to inform decisions of resource allocations within institutions, which we had just mentioned is extremely important. And we've seen greater emphasis on this topic over the years because we've seen a much higher number of studies that have been published in this field, as well as advancements in the methodology. So we're going to continue to see this grow. And also the need for this specific topic to be taught across different colleges. So colleges of pharmacy, schools of medicine have these within health services research and thinking about that, as well as schools of public health. And then of course, other disciplines within healthcare. Now, if we look at pharmacoeconomics in general, the demand to conduct and understand pharmacoeconomic analyses has really grown out of the need and pressure faced by decision makers, professionals, and healthcare providers to quantify and justify the value of products and services available or provided. And this goes across the globe, across the spectrum within healthcare. So it can go from the industry side, which many of those that conduct these types of analyses kind of fall within different departments within the pharmaceutical industry, as well as healthcare providers, and then those that are ultimately making decisions from payers or different perspectives. So everyone wants to know not only how do we best make a decision, are we getting the value for our money? How are we kind of documenting that or justifying it? So pharmacoeconomic analyses really allow decision makers to evaluate both the cost and patient health outcomes. So we're kind of moving beyond those just clinical outcomes that many healthcare providers are familiar with or within the healthcare world to think about multiple different outcomes, whether it be clinical, humanistic, and economic outcomes. Now, the information generated from these analyses are actually used by decision makers to make decisions on patient-by-patient level, as well as determine those national policies on a global scale. So whether you are interested in making a specific decision for one patient or across the globe for whoever or whatever communities you're serving, these are also used as that. Now, I want to be very clear that pharmacoeconomic analyses are not the be-all, end-all, meaning that once you use these, it's not the sole instrument or item that you're going to use to make a decision. And in the book, I talk a lot about the different types of tools or thought process or elements that go into a decision, pharmacoeconomic analyses being one of them. So it really plays a role in the evaluation of products and services, but it's really used as a tool to assist with these different types of items like shown here on this slide. So items such as coverage policies and benefit design, formulary management decisions, as well as pricing decisions. The drug approval process, like I'd mentioned, there's different departments within the pharmaceutical industry that focus very heavily on pharmacoeconomics, as well as developing drug use and treatment guidelines across various different institutions, and then disease management programs. So it plays a much larger role, it has played a much larger role over the years within these different things, and we'll continue to see that play more and more of a role with these types of things. Now, pharmacoeconomic analyses help answer specific questions. So if we go a little bit beyond that and say, well, what are they used for? What are people, what are the people asking in order to then say, like, let's conduct a pharmacoeconomic analysis? So some questions are like those shown here. This is not an all-inclusive list, but just to provide you an example. Is the added benefit of one pharmaceutical product or service worth its added cost? So often with some new initiatives cost more than the current standard practice. Should we add or remove a medication from the formulary? What are the costs and clinical implications of adding or removing a drug from the formulary? Should we reimburse for the product or service? And then things such as, should we implement a new service? Because now, again, like with pharmacoeconomics, you're looking at the costs and other health outcomes or patient outcomes that are of interest. So let's talk a little bit about the book itself. So The Art of Pharmacoeconomics is the first of its kind that takes a macro level approach to the methods, skills, and personnel needed to perform and evaluate pharmacoeconomics. Now, I say that it is the first of its kind because when you have the book, you will see the various different elements from the beginning of how do you think about structuring an analysis all the way to who you work with, what skills they need, how to design meetings, how to build kind of the infrastructure. And then it goes into a lot more detail about the actual methods of the different analyses and how you would then use what was created, the different frameworks and tools to help with that process, which is the pharmacoeconomic analysis canvas. Now the canvas, I'll talk briefly about it in general, but it is kind of like a roadmap and framework of the various different elements that go into analysis. Now I do recognize, and this is rightfully so, that many people do not actually conduct the pharmacoeconomic analyses, but they need to understand and be able to evaluate it. So that skill set to have means that you need to understand what goes into it. You need to understand all of these different elements to evaluate it appropriately. Now, the goals behind the book, which is really why I wrote the book, is the first is to simplify a complex discipline, to break down the skills gap and competency barriers faced by healthcare professionals. Now, many in the field know that there are resources out there with regards to pharmacoeconomics that go into very technical parts of the methodology, right? Because this degree, this area of focus has fellowships, masters, PhDs, those different types of things. But the discipline itself is quite complex. And so for those that are either using it for their own, fundamental building block knowledge of the subject, or those that are actually very well versed, but they I often hear that they want to better articulate and easily communicate for those not in the field. This provides a really great foundation for that because it really simplifies the complex discipline. It's written in active writing. It allows people to see the whole picture and simplify the context. It provides that the essential beginner's fundamental understanding of the principles to articulate, work on, evaluate, and use the tools and information in practice and in decision-making when needed and when appropriate. And so while it says kind of the beginner's guide, those that are far within the field will really benefit from it as well, because the tools provided, the approach taken is very different than what is currently out there with regards to how do we easily communicate this and how do we make it so that it is easily digestible and within our daily thought process. Also, the goal is to improve our abilities to really understand, interpret, and critically evaluate pharmacoeconomic literature that will hopefully assist in translating these results into practice and really determine its relevance. Like I mentioned before, the number of pharmacoeconomic analyses has really increased. So the hope is that this will allow the information that's generated through these analyses to be of higher quality, to be more useful, to be more integrated when appropriate. Now, ultimately, when you do read this book, you're going to see the world of healthcare decision-making a little differently, because you're going to think about costs differently. You're going to think about the various different elements. You're going to think about the various different stakeholders and the perspectives and how much that matters and how much that can drive decision-making. Now let's just briefly cover about what is in the book. So I talked a little bit about the book and the need for the book. So the book is broken up into 3 sections and it has 7 chapters. So in the first section, section 1 is about decision-making in pharmacoeconomics. So that really serves as a background and really introduces the concepts of healthcare allocation. I really briefly mentioned it here, of course, value, decision-making, outcomes research in general, and then it really goes into much more detail about the different pharmacoeconomic analyses that are conducted. In section 2, this is where you look into a lot more detail about the designing, conducting, and evaluating of pharmacoeconomic analyses. So this really goes through the process of designing, conducting, and evaluating, and it really incorporates different frameworks and tools that you can use to think about how do you go about building a team, who's involved, what skills are needed, because those that are often conducting pharmacoeconomic analyses are very diverse. You go from health economists to biostatisticians to epidemiologists to healthcare providers. So they're very diverse, and so I talk a lot about that in the book. And then about when you start working together, what does that look like? And then we go into the pharmacoeconomics canvas. which is really that roadmap and that framework that integrates all the different elements so that you can see them as a whole, and then we go into them in much more detail. Now, section 3 is just pulling it all together. It provides information on like the abbreviations that are used throughout, all the references are there. And then there are several empty pages at the end of the book so that as you're taking notes, because throughout the book, there are several reflection questions. So new information is introduced, or the information and content is introduced, and then you are able to take notes after. So who is this book written for? Now, we know that the responsibility to ensure proper use of resources is not limited to specific healthcare professionals. It's really a shared responsibility across the different stakeholders. So that means healthcare providers, professionals, industry, payers, society. So really anyone that makes decisions in healthcare will benefit from this book. Like I briefly mentioned before, that no prior in-depth knowledge or expertise in the field is needed so that you pick up this book and truly understand the various different elements. But the book is designed for those across the spectrum with regards to students, residents, fellows, healthcare providers, public health professionals, those within industry, and those that are making decisions. So the decision makers across the various different settings. Wherever you are in your career in terms of the expertise within this area, you benefit because of the added tools and different frameworks that aren't available in other resources. So that gets, and then as well as those that are lifelong learners. So those that are interested in broadening their scope of skills would really benefit from understanding these types of analyses. And then because the ultimate goal is to better inform decisions, right? To address the challenges that we face and create these transformational improvements that add value. And then ultimately, if you want to utilize those more objective approaches or start thinking through how do I make more objective decisions, and then also discover what other skills you really need. So pharmacoeconomics, it's been growing, it will continue to grow. So these are skill sets that are important to have now and into the future. Now, for the use of this in the use of the content of this book, other than, if you would like to just learn the discipline of pharmacoeconomics and outcomes research, this is a great fundamental book for that. I mentioned a lot about its use both in the classroom. So if you are a professor, which I know some audience members are, and are looking to teach this or are already teaching this subject in the various classes, this is a great tool to give that overarching macro level approach to this discipline, the various different elements, and then you can dive deeper into whatever elements that you see fit within that. This is a great resource for those that want to conduct and evaluate pharmacoeconomic analyses, whether it's in those professional settings, so in your current position, or you're doing it within the various different learning environments like residents, fellows, or different projects or research. And it's also a wonderful supplement to existing pharmacoeconomic studies. So I know a lot of professionals that have been teaching this area for quite some time, and they like the resources that they are using. But this is a wonderful supplement because, like I mentioned, it takes on a different element of how we look at the various different factors and kind of building blocks, as we mentioned there, for these analyses. So it's a great supplement, digs in through about the building your teams and those different individuals. So that definitely adds value there. So that brings it to just kind of the summary that I have prepared for you guys. Now I will answer some questions, but if there is interest in the book, it is available on Amazon. We do have some information more about it on the website, salusvitegroup.com. Of course, also you're welcome to email us any questions that you have in general. So during this time now, like I mentioned, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And so I will start answering them now. Okay, so there's a question about, is it sufficient to say that a cost-effective analysis was done from a payer perspective, or are more specific assumptions needed to be declared to place the results in context for decision and application? So that question there is, it's a great question with regards to a very specific element of the analyses. So what's great about it is that the recognition of what perspective you need to take, right? Within these analyses, we always say that perspective is half the battle, and understanding that. And anytime, and you make a great point here, because anytime you do any of these analyses or even evaluate them, you always have to look to see what assumptions were made. So anytime you do any of these analyses and there are assumptions, you need to declare those assumptions, because those that are evaluating it are going to evaluate and ask whether you've already made those assumptions. Now, whether it needs to be placed in the context of the decision or the decision maker, it does need to be, right? So when you have the perspective in mind in the context of what outcomes are important to that decision maker, what's going to allow them, what will ultimately allow them to make the decision. So that's kind of the framework you use. So building off of your question, you go to your perspectives, you always state your assumptions, because the assumptions are what the ultimate decision maker will look for to see if it's applicable to their type of situation, and then whether they're going to use that information to make a decision, right? Okay, so this is a question. So you said you seem to be focusing on drugs and medications. What about medical devices or capital value products? So this actually, so in the book, we don't necessarily just state that it is just medications. So it can, because the actual framework of these analyses can be used for medical devices, so the products or the services. So we're even saying it's not just, so it's whether you want to start a new clinical service, you can use those types of analyses. So these are actually transferable. And in the book, I actually focus a lot on making sure that it is more of making sure that the understanding is more on the frameworks and the methods, and then how you can integrate whatever options or choices that you have. So if it's in a product, if it's in the product space or medical device space, is it over one medical device versus no device, or standard of practice, or between two devices? So the same methodology would apply. It's just then what the actual inputs and model inputs are there. So there's a question about the deletion of drugs like antibiotics or anticoagulation. Is there evidence based on decision according to drug category in this book? So in the book, this is more of a methods-driven book, meaning that we're not making recommendations as to the choice of one. I'm not making recommendations as to the choice of one product or service. It is trying to say that you ultimately, as a decision maker, as somebody that needs to make these types of decisions, whether it is to not use a specific antibiotic or not use a specific medication or not use a product, or maybe not start that service, or any of those choices that you might have across the healthcare spectrum, regardless of whether you're a clinician or a provider, payer, industry even. And so the book actually more focuses on what is the thought process, what are the inputs when you have those types of decisions. So in this specific case, we're not saying that you should use one medication over the other. We're not advocating for a specific specific interventions. We're just I'm giving you the ability to look at it from a structural methods-based objective way, so that whatever questions you have, you will be able to, start thinking about it in a more systematic way. Now checking here. Okay, I think I had a question about my PharmD. So I got my PharmD from Purdue University in Indiana, and then my postdoc was at University of Michigan. So I'm focused on that. So within there, so yeah, I do want to stress, like I had mentioned, when you are trying to think about this discipline in general and trying to understand it, because it seems so methods driven, what this book does that's different than others is that it really is also designed for those that want to evaluate these analyses, meaning that do you even want to be able to adequately answer if something is cost effective? Because the term cost effective is so widely misused. And when you read this book, you will really realize everything that goes in to actually stating whether something is cost effective, and then based off of your perspective and what it is. So it truly gives you a better understanding of what it does it mean to evaluate costs, what are the different cost inputs, and how can we use it within one of our tools within the decision-making process. So I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. I think we just have one more question I will take. Okay, so this question is, how can value outcome-based contracts better incorporate incentives directed to all stakeholders, particularly payers, when leveraging digital innovation, emerging orphan drugs? So I think, so here, so that's a great question with regards to, so PROs is like the patient-reported outcomes, and looking at, so value-based contracts in general is a very important topic. It is something that many stakeholders are moving towards. I think the question here is when you start thinking about to all stakeholders, because when you start breaking down when you do these types of analyses, they can look very different to different stakeholders. So then really recognizing who your ultimate decision maker is, and then starting with those types of analyses. With high-priced products, again, it really depends on the industry. It depends on who the stakeholder is. It might be quote unquote, in whatever example, not necessarily this one, but might be cost effective to one stakeholder and then not for another. So I think it's really trying to break down what is the ultimate decision you want to make and being very intentional about that. And I talk a lot about it in the book, is we're kind of recognizing what your decision question is and how, you know, what the result of this type of analysis will do for your decision. Because sometimes in specific cases, we might make a decision regardless of if we do an analysis due to, you know, ethical reasons or kind of a societal perspective or those types of things. So kind of recognizing what is the ultimate question that you are trying or decision that you're trying to make, and will that analysis influence that decision? Okay, so I think we are at time. So thank you all again. Thank you all for your interest in this topic, in this book. If you have any questions, feel free to contact our team at contact@Salus Group regarding the question. And if you do happen to grab the book, please send me your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think of the book, how you benefited from it. And again, the book is available on Amazon. So thank you all so much for joining us today.